Welcome back to the Deep Dive, the place where we turn massive stacks of research into hopefully some actionable understanding.
And the sources for this deep dive are,
Yeah.
well, they're not just critical.
Oh,
They're fundamentally revolutionary in how they view modern finance.
they really are. They
They're-
challenge the core premise of what financial security even is for most people today.
They really do. They assert that the currency most of us save, the US dollar, the euro, the yen, it's not wealth at all.
That's the hook right there, isn't it? It just flips everything we've been taught completely on its head. I mean, most people believe that, responsible adulthood means you work hard, you pay your taxes, and you put your extra earnings into a dollar savings account or a low-risk bond.
It's supposed to be the safest thing you can do, the bedrock.
Exactly.
But these sources, they classify those dollars not as assets, but as debt instruments.
Liabilities.
Liabilities, yeah, that are systematically designed to lose value over time. They argue that the entire financial system is built to extract wealth, slowly and legally, from people who trust paper.
So if you're saving dollars right now, you are, and this is a direct quote, participating in a losing game.
It's a very sharp claim.
It is, and it brings up some really uncomfortable questions right away. So our mission for this deep dive is to explore this distinction between money and debt. We're going to trace the history back to that critical shift in 1971.
And then analyze the specific hard assets, gold, silver, and now Bitcoin, that these sources propose as really the only true preservers of generational wealth.
We have to understand the mechanics of how the system works.
So we can understand how to defend ourselves against it, yeah?
And we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room here, the
Yeah.
core piece of evidence for this entire critique.
The big number.
The big one. The claim that since the dollar was completely disconnected from gold back in 71, it has lost something like 98% of its purchasing power.
It's a staggering figure. The destruction of 98 cents of every dollar saved. That's really the engine driving this whole thesis.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with definitions, because if we don't agree on what money actually is, we can't really understand why the modern system is, according to this analysis, structurally flawed.
To understand the present, we really have to look at the past. Historically, what made something money was its ability to work across borders, across time, without needing to trust an individual or a government.
Right.
And the sources, they define real money using three essential characteristics. All three have to be there.
And the first one, which is arguably the most crucial for this whole debate, is it has to be a store of value.
Mm-hmm.
This is the quality that lets you, defer consumption. If I work hard today and save that wealth, it has to be retrievable. It has to retain its purchasing power decades from now.
You should be able to bury it in the ground.
Yeah. And dig it up 30 years later, and it should buy roughly the same amount of food or shelter.
Exactly. The source notes that if something fails as a store of value, it ultimately fails as money, period.
So what's the second one?
The second is being a medium of exchange, it has to be widely accepted for trade. It has to be portable, recognizable.
And the third?
Third, it has to serve as a unit of account, a stable, reliable measure you can price things in. It makes it easy to compare costs.
And what the sources really hammer home is that for millennia, gold and silver just.
Yeah.
They did this. They fulfilled all three roles across, virtually every major civilization.
From ancient Rome to the Chinese dynasties.
Yeah.
You could take gold from one continent to another or hold it for centuries, and it would still represent a consistent claim on real goods and services. It was just stable.
Proving its absolute stability as a store of value.
Now, contrast that universal, historically proven standard with our modern currency, what the sources call Federal Reserve notes.
Which are, by definition,
Promissory notes. They're an IOU.
Oh.
When you hold a dollar, you're actually holding a liability on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve.
Hold on. So if I have $100 in my wallet, I feel like I own an asset. You're saying I actually own a piece of someone else's debt?
That is the core definitional switch. That dollar is a promise. It's a non-interest-bearing debt obligation of the Fed.
And it's backed only by what?
The government's future ability to force people to pay taxes, and critically, its ability to just print more currency to pay its bills.
So it only exists because a government decrees it has value.
That's the term fiat money. Let it be done. You're holding an IOU, not an asset that stands on its own, independent of political promises.
The sources, they map out this transition from, real money to pure debt through two specific, really foundational moments in American history.
Yeah, two moments that systematically eroded the public's relationship with real money. And the first one happened way back in the depths of the Great Depression in 1933.
This is a really dark moment in financial history, isn't it?
It is. Executive Order 6102, issued by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, at the time, America was struggling, and the official justification was that they needed to centralize gold reserves to, stabilize the banks and stimulate the economy.
Okay, that sounds plausible on the surface.
But the way they did it is what our sources really scrutinize.
The order made it illegal for U.S. citizens to own monetary gold.
Illegal. Everyone was compelled, under penalty of law, to turn in their gold holdings to the Federal Reserve or the Treasury.
This wasn't a voluntary sale. This was forced compliance.
And this is where the source pinpoints the first act of, massive government betrayal against its own citizens. They collected the gold at the official rate at the time, which was $20.67 per ounce.
Okay.
But shortly after they consolidated most of the country's gold, the government just unilaterally revalued the price to $35 an ounce.
So they took it from the people at $20 and then immediately said it was worth $35.
Instantly creating a 69% profit for the Treasury. They essentially confiscated nearly 70% of the future purchasing power of the gold from the very citizens who had just turned it in.
Wow.
Precisely. The people who were responsible, who followed the law, they saw their wealth potential just suppressed for the government's gain.
And this event, the sources argue, established a critical lesson.
That governments who control the paper currency will always, eventually, find a reason to debase or confiscate real assets to solve their own financial problems.
That really sets the stage for the second, and you could argue more destructive, shift, the 1971 break.
Mm-hmm.
The sources frame this as the definitive moment we went to a pure debt-based economy.
This was President Richard Nixon, and it was the collapse of the post-World War II Bretton Woods system. We need a little context here.
Right.
Under Bretton Woods, which was set up in 1944, the whole world agreed that the U.S. dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and then all other major currencies would be pegged to the dollar.
Which is what made the dollar the global reserve currency.
Exactly. And the system worked okay for a while until the U.S. started aggressively printing dollars in the 1960s.
To fund costly, non-productive ventures, specifically the Vietnam War and a lot of domestic spending programs.
Correct. As the U.S. printed, foreign central banks, who held huge amounts of dollars for trade, they started doing the math. They realized the dollars in their vaults greatly outnumbered the actual gold the U.S. held to back them.
So they lost confidence.
They lost confidence. Crucially, France, under Charles de Gaulle, famously started demanding physical gold in exchange for their dollars. They were literally flying warships to New York to pick it up.
And the U.S. gold reserves were just hemorrhaging.
They were. So Nixon's decision on August 15th, 1971, was to close the gold window. He basically defaulted on that 1944 promise.
He severed the dollar's last, very thin link to gold.
He called it a temporary measure to protect the dollar from speculators.
But it was the moment the dollar officially became a pure, unbacked fiat currency. Money by government decree.
And here's the mechanism that proves sources claim that dollars are dead. When the government spends more than it collects in taxes, which is almost always, the Treasury issues debt.
U.S. Treasury bonds, which are IOUs.
Right. The Federal Reserve, which, the sources remind us, is a private corporation with a government mandate, it buys these IOUs.
But the Fed doesn't pay with money it collected from taxes or profits.
No, it pays by literally creating the money out of thin air.
Just typing it into existence.
Precisely. Through simple digital keystrokes, the Fed adds digits to the Treasury's account. This process is called monetizing the debt. It injects new dollars into the system that represent the government's liability.
So the money we work for and save is literally born from debt.
And its perpetual increase is guaranteed by the government's perpetual need to fund its deficits. This is what fundamentally shifts the currency from an asset to a liability.
This perpetual debt creation has a direct and really detrimental effect on savers. The sources don't even call it inflation. They call it a stealth tax.
It's a critical distinction.
We're taught that inflation is when prices go up. The sources argue the opposite. Prices go up because the currency is losing value.
It's a semantic but vital difference. The increase in the supply of dollars dilutes the value of every dollar already in existence.
And that dilution is the mechanism of the stealth tax.
And what's really critical is understanding who gets taxed first.
This is the Cantillon Effect you're talking about, right?
That's the formal term for it, yes. The new money created by the Fed, it doesn't get distributed evenly. It flows first to the central government, the large banks, and politically connected corporations and asset holders.
So they get to spend the new money before it's filtered down through the economy.
meaning they buy goods, services, and assets at yesterday's prices. They are the primary beneficiaries of the printing.
While the rest of us.
By the time that money filters down through the financial system, reaching the average saver, the worker, the person living paycheck to paycheck, prices for necessities, housing, healthcare, food have already started to inflate.
So this is the core wealth transfer mechanism.
The sources claim it is. The political and asset-holding class benefit from inflation, while the working class suffers a permanent destruction of their savings.
But wait a minute, the government publishes the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. It's supposed to be based on science and careful calculation. If the CPI says inflation is, 3%, why should we believe it's actually 10% to 15%? That sounds like, well, extreme alarmism.
This is a point where the sources are incredibly critical of modern metrics. They contend that the way inflation is calculated has been deliberately altered, starting in the 1980s.
How so?
Historically, CPI tracked a fixed basket of goods that represented what people actually bought. Today, they use techniques like substitution.
Which assumes you'll replace an expensive steak with cheaper hamburger.
Exactly. And hedonic adjustments, where they claim a new laptop is more valuable because it has more features even if the price is higher. So they can say the price didn't really go up.
They're adjusting the definition of inflation instead of just reporting the objective price increase.
That's the argument. If you use the older, more honest methodologies that were standard in the 1980s, the sources claim the current real inflation rate is closer to 10% to 15% annually.
So if your bank account is paying you 1% interest,
But your currency is losing 10% to 15% of its value every single year, you are losing 9% to 14% of your wealth every year just by holding it.
this is why the sources insist that savers are, by design, losers in the fiat system. That 98% loss of value since 1971. It's a massive abstract number. We need to ground this in the reality of someone's life. What does that debt creation actually mean for, say, retirement or saving for a home?
The destruction of 98% of the dollar's purchasing power is, well, the sources call it the central tragedy for the middle class.
Yep.
Let's go back to that $100,000 example.
Okay, so imagine a responsible parent in 1971 saves $100,000. They set it aside for their child's future, maybe to buy a first home or secure a retirement. They trusted the system.
Today, that $100,000 still nominally exists, but its real-world buying power is only $2,000 of what it could purchase back then.
$2,000.
This is more than a loss. It's what they call a generational betrayal. That money might have bought 2 or 3 homes outright in 1971.
And today,
Today, it might cover the down payment on a modest car, maybe a few months of mortgage payments. This is the core thesis. The fiat system systematically destroys the wealth of the responsible saver.
and people struggle with this because the numbers on paper look bigger. They see their home value rising, they see their 401k growing in nominal dollars, and they assume they're getting ahead.
But the value of the measuring stick they're using, the dollar, is shrinking faster than their nominal gains.
There's an analogy in the source material that really drives this point home, the gasoline versus silver quarter comparison.
It's a great one. In 1964, a gallon of gas cost about 25 cents, and that 25-cent coin was made of 90% silver.
And if I tried to pay for a gallon of gas today with a paper, a modern 25-cent quarter, I'd be laughed out of the stage.
Completely, the paper money failed. However, if you take that same 1964 silver quarter today, the value of the silver in it is now approximately $4.50 in these Federal Reserve notes.
And a gallon of gas today costs, what, around $3.50.
So the silver quarter has maintained its purchasing power and then some. It still buys a gallon of gas.
The silver retained its function as a stable store of value over 6 decades.
While the paper failed, the physical asset remains stable against the cost of energy, a fundamental measure of value. While the paper currency, which was just a promise, it collapsed in relative terms.
And we see the same illusion in housing, right? The median U.S. home price in '71 was around $25,000.
And today it's well over $400,000. It looks like the house has become 16 times more valuable.
But the source argues that the house's underlying value, the shelter, the security, the land, that's remained relatively constant in terms of real money, like gold.
What actually happened is the dollar became 16 times less valuable. The price tag went up because a measuring stick was severely deflated.
People feel richer because the number on their property tax bill is high, but they're still buying the same structure, and all their costs, maintenance, insurance, taxes, are also priced in those same inflating dollars.
And now we have to look forward. If the system guarantees this debasement, We need to know how much debasement is already baked into the cake.
This is where the source describes the terrifying iceberg view of national debt. We hear the official, scary figure, currently over $36 trillion in gross national debt.
That $36 trillion, the sources argue, is only the visible tip of the iceberg. It's the government's highly visible, maxed-out credit card.
And the real figure.
The real figure, once you include unfunded liabilities, explodes to over $200 trillion.
Okay, what exactly are unfunded liabilities, and why are they so much worse than the debt we always hear about?
Unfunded liabilities are future legal promises that the government has made to the people, but for which there is no dedicated solvent funding stream.
So things like Social Security and Medicare.
Exactly. The vast majority of this $200 trillion is made up of projected obligations for Social Security, Medicare, and government pensions. These are binding contracts, promises to pay future benefits that current and future tax receipts simply cannot cover.
So it's not just the current bills. It's like promising your 4-year-old today that you'll pay for their entire college, their wedding, and their retirement, even though you don't have the money saved.
It's worse than that. It's a guaranteed deficit commitment. When you combine the existing $36 trillion debt with the certainty of needing $200 trillion more to meet promises, the conclusion is just mathematical.
This debt is impossible to repay through traditional means.
You can't tax or cut your way out of it. The political and social chaos would be intolerable.
So the only viable political path for governments is inflation.
They must print currency to inflate away the real value of the debt and meet those promises.
The source contends this guarantees future debasement far, far exceeding the 98% loss we've already seen.
The dollar is destined for failure because the government has chosen inflation as its default mechanism for debt repayment.
And when you look at that historical 98% loss and connect it to the certainty of $200 trillion in future printing,
the sources argue that holding fiat currency is effectively an act of financial self-sabotage.
here's where it gets really interesting. If the current system is engineered to default through inflation, we need to identify what assets are outside that system.
And the sources point definitively to the scarcity solution.
So we shift our focus to assets that are defined by their independence and their fixed supply. Starting with gold, which has been the world's standard of wealth preservation for, 5 millennia?
It's the ultimate counterparty risk-free asset. Its properties make it so.
Gold's stability isn't just cultural, it's physical. The sources list its properties. It doesn't rust, it's incredibly durable.
It's divisible, you can melt it down to exact weights, it's portable. A small volume represents enormous value, and most importantly, its supply is fixed.
The scarcity factor is what allows gold to maintain its purchasing power.
To visualize this, the sources note that the total amount of gold ever mined in human history, every piece of jewelry, every coin, every bar, is only about 200,000 metric tons.
That sounds like a lot until you put it into perspective.
It's surprisingly small. That entire global supply would fit into a single cube, about 72 feet on each side.
Wow, that's everything.
That's everything. And that supply increases very slowly, by only about 1.5% annually through mining, which is costly and difficult.
So when you hold a physical cube of wealth that grows by 1.5% a year versus a digitally created currency that's growing by 15% or 20% a year,
You instantly understand why one preserves value and the other is guaranteed to debase. Gold is the constant. The currency used to measure it is the variable that fails.
that is the critical mental shift the sources are trying to promote.
And while gold is the foundation for long-term preservation, the sources single out silver as the asset with the most explosive potential for growth.
They call it the poor man's gold.
Because of its accessibility, yeah.
Yeah.
And its potential comes from its critical dual role.
Silver is unique because it's both a monetary metal, it was used as currency, and it's also a highly demanded industrial commodity.
And industrial demand accounts for roughly half of all silver mined globally.
And what's driving that demand?
The accelerating transition to clean energy and electronics. Silver is absolutely essential for solar panels, EV batteries, touch screens, high-end electronics. As the world pushes for electrification, the demand for silver is just spiking.
But this industrial use creates a supply problem that gold doesn't really have. Gold can be melted down and recycled from old jewelry or electronics pretty much forever.
Right. Silver used in industrial processes is often dispersed into landfills or waste streams in tiny amounts, which makes it economically impossible to recover.
So a significant portion of the global silver supply is permanently removed from circulation every single year.
That's the depletion problem. And we have rising industrial demand meeting a finite, physically depleting supply.
which the sources say is creating a structural deficit in the market.
Absolutely. Mining production just isn't keeping up with this surging demand. So this deficit is being filled by depleting the above-ground stockpiles, which signals future physical scarcity. The inventory is going down while consumption is rising.
The sources also point to a critical geopolitical signal here.
China's January 1st export ban on physical silver.
What does that signal?
It's a massive signal that key industrial powers recognize silver's strategic importance. They are not willing to let their finite physical metal leave the country in exchange for Federal Reserve notes, which they see as endlessly printing liabilities. They're hoarding it for future industrial use.
And all of this leads to the source's strong argument for extreme undervaluation.
They recall the peak silver price during the Hunt Brothers run in 1980, which hit $50 an ounce. But the dollar had far greater purchasing power in 1980 than it does today.
Of course.
So if you adjust that $50 peak price for what the sources call real inflation, using those honest methodologies, that $50 is equivalent to over $200 today.
And if the current price of silver is hovering around, say, $65 an ounce.
This suggests silver is undervalued by a factor of 3 against its inflation-adjusted historical peak. This potential for repricing, combined with its accessibility, makes silver a very powerful defense against fiat destruction.
Okay, so if silver is so fundamentally undervalued and facing this physical scarcity, why isn't the price already $200?
The answer, according to the sources, involves a complex and a deliberate system of market manipulation.
Designed to protect the financial status quo.
Exactly. This takes us back to the classic example of the Hunt brothers in 1979 and 1980. They recognized silver was undervalued, and they tried to corner the market, buying hundreds of millions of ounces and driving the price from about $5 up to $50.
They were basically exposing the weakness of the paper market by demanding physical delivery.
Precisely. And as the price climbed, the financial institutions that are heavily short on silver betting the price would go down, they faced catastrophic losses.
And the government stepped in.
The sources detail how the government and the COMEX, the main commodities exchange, intervened directly to protect these big banks. They implemented the infamous Rule 7.
Which prohibited traders from taking on any new long positions. So you could only sell, you couldn't buy.
It's blatant direct market intervention to force the price down. It protected the institutions selling paper promises they couldn't back and destroyed the wealth of those who correctly recognized the value of the physical asset.
It crashed the price from $50 down to $10 in a matter of days.
And the message sent was clear. If ordinary investors try to expose the paper fraud by demanding physical assets, the rules will be changed overnight to protect the central system.
And the sources claim this manipulation continues today, just in a more sophisticated form. They point to that massive $920 million fine against J.P. Morgan.
For spoofing, yeah. Spoofing is placing large buy or sell orders that you never intend to execute, just to trick algorithmic traders into moving the price so you can buy low or sell high.
And J.P. Morgan used this for years to systematically suppress the price of silver.
But here's the astounding irony. While they were publicly suppressing the paper price, which allowed them to accumulate massive positions on the cheap,
they were quietly building the largest physical silver stockpile in history.
Accumulating over 1 billion ounces. They understood the fraud. They knew the paper price was fake and the physical metal was the real store of value. They used the manipulation of the paper market to acquire the real asset.
This brings us to the heart of the paper versus physical fraud.
The COMEX trades futures contracts, paper claims that promise future delivery of physical silver. But the sources estimate that the ratio of paper claims to actual physical silver in the vaults is staggering.
What's the number?
Anywhere from 100 to 300 paper ounces for every single physical ounce.
So it's unsustainable leverage.
Totally. If even a fraction of those paper contract holders demanded physical delivery at the same time, the exchange would instantly default. It would expose the massive fraud. This is why the sources predict that as industrial demand increases and physical stocks are drawn down, this fragile paper manipulation system is set up for an eventual price explosion.
So we have gold as the ultimate foundation, silver as the high-leverage industrial asset, and then the sources introduce a third asset class, one that operates entirely outside the physical world but offers its own unique defenses against the fiat system, Bitcoin.
Bitcoin was born from the wreckage of the 2008 financial crisis. Satoshi Nakamoto created it in 2009.
The context is crucial.
It is. Governments and central banks were bailing out reckless banks with massive currency creation. Bitcoin was created explicitly as a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, a form of money that could not be controlled, manipulated, or inflated by centralized authorities.
And its fundamental defense is guaranteed scarcity.
Fiat currency is unlimited. Gold has a slow, difficult-to-increase supply. Bitcoin is hard-coded at a cap of 21 million units. That's the rule. And that rule cannot be changed because the network is entirely decentralized.
This mathematical certainty makes Bitcoin the single scarcest asset ever created in human history.
Gold sees a 1.5% annual increase in supply. Bitcoin's increase is programmatically reduced every 4 years, the halving event, until the cap is hit. The network's security is fundamentally tied to this fixed supply.
And the scarcity is why, in just 16 years, it's gone from zero value to being a globally recognized asset worth over $100,000 per coin at its peak.
The sources highlight Bitcoin's key advantages, which address the primary drawbacks of physical metals. The first is portability and seizure resistance.
Right. Physical gold and silver, if you accumulate enough, they get heavy, bulky, hard to move, especially across borders.
Bitcoin solves this completely. You can transfer massive amounts of wealth instantly across any border without permission just by carrying a small hardware wallet or
memorizing a 12-word seed phrase.
Exactly. In an era of increasing capital controls and geopolitical instability, this freedom from government interference is a huge advantage.
However, the sources are very balanced here. They emphasize the significant drawbacks, and the most obvious one is volatility.
Indeed. Bitcoin's price swings are massive. We've seen it drop from $60,000 down to $15,000, only to recover and soar to new all-time highs.
So it's still highly speculative. It's not yet the stable store of value that gold has been for centuries.
Not yet. And philosophically, the sources note that Bitcoin lacks intrinsic value in the traditional sense. Gold and silver can be used in industry or jewelry.
Bitcoin is pure information.
Its value comes entirely from network functionality and collective agreement. It's conceptually similar to fiat in that sense, but it's redeemed by its fixed supply limit.
And this leads to the most critical risk, technological dependence.
Bitcoin requires the internet, electricity, and the global network of miners and nodes to function. If there's a massive grid failure or a long-term internet disruption, your physical gold and silver are still visible, tangible, and useful.
But your Bitcoin wealth becomes temporarily or even permanently inaccessible.
And this technological risk is really the core of the debate between the two camps. You have traditional hard money advocates, like the economist Peter Schiff, who vehemently dismisses Bitcoin for this very reason.
Because it's digital and lacks that intrinsic physical value.
Schiff's argument, which the sources acknowledge, is that when the fiat system truly collapses, physical reality will reassert itself. He argues paper money and digital money are both useless when a real crisis hits, and only the physical metal will retain value.
And yet you have political figures, like Donald Trump, increasingly embracing Bitcoin as a defensive asset against central bank overreach. So how do we reconcile these two powerful but contradictory views?
The sources conclude that the gold versus Bitcoin debate is a false dichotomy.
They're not mutually exclusive.
They're complementary defense mechanisms.
I like that framing. They defend against different failure modes.
Exactly. Gold and silver serve as the ultimate insurance against a total societal or infrastructure collapse. They provide physical, recognized value in a scenario where technology fails.
And Bitcoin?
Bitcoin provides unmatched defense against capital controls, currency seizure, and the need to move large amounts of wealth across a functioning but hostile digital world. Holding all three gives you a diversified, robust defense strategy against the failing fiat system.
So we've established that the sources view dollars as debt and scarce assets as the only path to real wealth preservation. Now the focus shifts entirely to application and risk mitigation.
And the first concept you really need to internalize is counterparty risk.
What is that exactly?
Counterparty risk is the risk that the entity on the other side of your asset, the counterparty, will fail to fulfill their obligation. If an asset's value depends on someone else's promise, it carries counterparty risk.
Which applies to almost every traditional financial instrument, right? If I own a bond, the government has to pay me back. A stock, the company has to stay solvent.
If your dollars are in a bank, you're depending on the bank's solvency and the government honoring FDIC insurance. All of these require trust in a third party.
And that trust, according to these sources, is misplaced in a system that's structurally bankrupt and guaranteed to inflate.
This is why physical gold and silver eliminate counterparty risk entirely. They are Tier 1 assets at the very top of the asset pyramid.
They are independence incarnate.
They are. Gold is gold, silver is silver. They are tangible assets that exist independent of any promise, any government, or any bank balance sheet. If every financial institution on Earth collapses tomorrow, your physical metal still holds recognized transferable value.
It's the only way to achieve true independence from the system.
And Bitcoin, again, falls into that unique category. It doesn't need a traditional bank or government counterparty, but it does have those technological dependencies that gold doesn't.
If the system works, Bitcoin is untouchable. If the system fails entirely, it becomes inaccessible.
The ultimate survival strategy has to recognize both of those risks.
And if the solution is physical and digital independence, the logistics of storing and controlling these assets become paramount.
For physical metals, the challenges are immediate and practical. If you follow the source's advice and accumulate significant physical wealth, weight and space become real issues.
The sources talk about silver filling grain boxes stacked to the ceiling.
Because of its low value-to-weight ratio, yeah. Gold is easier to store due to its density, but the security risk increases dramatically.
And the universal advice from every analyst in this space is discretion.
Absolutely. Never, under any circumstances, should you tell anyone, besides maybe a spouse, exactly where your physical assets are stored.
Security is paramount.
And the recommended strategy is diversified storage. Keep some in a high-quality, bolted-down home safe, use private non-bank vaults, and potentially hold some offshore to hedge against domestic capital controls or civil unrest. You have to control the metal yourself.
Digital assets like Bitcoin present the exact opposite challenge. No weight, no physical security issues, but absolute self-banking responsibility.
The wealth is tied to a small hardware wallet, or that memorized seed phrase. The convenience is unparalleled. You can walk through an airport with $1 billion of value in your head.
But the risk is also absolute.
If you lose or forget that seed phrase, your wealth is permanently gone, lost forever on the blockchain with no possibility of recovery. The technological independence comes with the heaviest burden of control.
It's easy to dismiss these warnings as, extreme, but the sources emphasize that the collapse of fiat currency isn't a remote possibility, it's a historical certainty. It's happened to every empire and every unbacked currency in history.
The Weimar Republic in Germany in the 1920s is the textbook case we have to study. Devastated after World War I, the German government printed money aggressively to pay reparations and fund domestic spending. And the inflation accelerated from a persistent problem to catastrophic hyperinflation.
And what were the consequences for the ordinary citizen who was just taught to save their paper money?
By November 1923, prices were doubling every 3 days. Savings accounts, insurance policies, pensions, everything denominated in paper currency was wiped out. People were literally bringing wheelbarrows full of cash to buy a single loaf of bread.
The currency became more valuable as wallpaper than as money.
The entire middle class was destroyed. Their crime was simply trusting the paper system.
But the sources stress the counterpoint. Those who held tangible, scarce assets survived.
Absolutely. Those who owned physical gold, silver, land, businesses, or foreign currencies, they waited out the crisis. When the dust settled and a new currency was issued, they were the ones who had retained their wealth.
And they used that preserved capital to buy up assets at huge discounts.
Land, factories, homes from the desperate, newly impoverished, paper-rich class. Wealth didn't vanish. It simply transferred from the unprepared paper holders to the prepared asset holders.
And this pattern is universal. Revolutionary France, Zimbabwe, Argentina, Venezuela. But the U.S. is often seen as the great exception because the dollar is the global reserve currency.
The sources warn that this belief in American exceptionalism is the fatal flaw made by every declining empire, from Spain to Britain to the Soviet Union. The difference with the U.S. is just the scale and speed of the inevitable collapse when confidence is finally broken.
And that confidence, the sources argue, is already eroding globally. We're seeing definitive signals that the dollar's reign as the unchallenged reserve currency is ending.
The most visible signal is the coalition of BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa.
Right.
They are actively developing alternative payment systems to bypass the dollar in international trade. And crucially, they are simultaneously buying massive amounts of gold, which suggests they intend to back their future currencies with physical assets, not debt.
The bedrock of the dollar's global dominance since 1974 has been the petrodollar system, where Saudi Arabia priced oil exclusively in dollars,
which forced all nations to hold dollars for energy.
And that foundation is now fracturing.
The sources cite the huge signal in 2023 when Saudi Arabia began accepting the Chinese yuan for oil sales to China, breaking that 50-year precedent. This is a clear indicator that the world's reliance on the dollar is diminishing.
And why does that matter to the average listener here in the U.S.?
It matters because the world holds trillions of dollars in reserves that are no longer strictly necessary for trade if the dollar loses reserve status. When nations start dumping those dollars, that massive supply will flood back into the U.S. economy.
And supply and demand dictate that when a massive influx of dollars hits a constrained domestic market, prices explode.
Precisely. The source material warns this won't be a gradual years-long event like typical inflation. It will be a rapid, catastrophic surge, prices rising over months, possibly over weeks.
For the average person holding all their wealth in savings accounts, 401ks, and cash, this is the moment their wealth evaporates in real terms.
So if the collapse of the fiat system is guaranteed, not a matter of if, but when, the final step is defining a survival strategy.
And the sources advocate a diversified approach across the three scarce assets.
Gold for ultimate long-term preservation and insurance against chaos. Silver for its industrial-driven upside and its accessibility for the average person. And Bitcoin for speculative upside and technological defense against capital controls.
Let's illustrate the choice between saving debt and owning assets using the sources' stark comparison. They use a $10,000 savings pool over a decade.
Okay, if you leave that $10,000 in a savings account earning a generous 1% interest while the real inflation rate runs at, say, 10%, which is the rate the sources suggest for 10 years, you might see $11,000 on your bank statement.
The number went up.
But the real purchasing power of that money would have plummeted to roughly $4,000. That's a 60% real wealth destruction simply for trusting the paper system.
Wow. Now compare that to the asset strategy.
If that same $10,000 had been used to buy, for example, 150 ounces of silver at $65 an ounce, and silver repriced to its inflation-adjusted value of $200.
Those 150 ounces would be worth $30,000.
Or, if a portion was placed into Bitcoin, say, enough to buy zero point 0.1 BTC and network adoption continues, that investment could multiply exponentially. The choice is clear, guaranteed. Slow loss of wealth by saving debt, or the potential for significant multiplication by owning real assets that appreciate as the dollar itself devalues.
And the call to action is urgent. Convert dollars into real assets now, while silver is still accessible at $65 an ounce and before the majority panics.
Once the herd realizes the fraud, the stampede out of paper will cause prices and premiums on physical assets to become enormous, and availability will just dry up completely.
So what does this all mean? It really requires a complete shift in your financial philosophy. The core lesson from these sources is that dollars are liabilities. They are debt instruments designed to be devalued.
And gold, silver, and Bitcoin are real assets, representing true independence and lasting wealth.
This is the critical generational lesson that the wealthy inherently understand, right? They accumulate assets that can't be printed or created by keystrokes.
While the middle class, conversely, is taught to save paper currency. The system is perfectly engineered to facilitate a slow, steady, systematic transfer of wealth from those who save paper to those who own scarce assets.
So the necessary mental shift is to stop measuring your wealth in fleeting paper dollars. You need to start thinking in ounces.
How many ounces of gold or silver do you own? How many units of Bitcoin? That is your real independent wealth, and the dollar price is only the constantly changing variable indicator of its value.
The sources are blunt. The game is rigged to extract your wealth through perpetual currency debasement.
But by understanding those rules, by recognizing the historical certainty that fiat currency must fail, you have the opportunity to opt out. You can convert the trash paper into real wealth that protects your family when the inevitable collapse of the currency arrives.
The source suggests the collapse of the fiat system is inevitable, not if, but when. Considering this historical certainty and the fact that wealth transfers from the unprepared paper holders to the prepared asset holders during chaos, what is the first tangible asset you will acquire to shift your family's foundation from debt to independence?
That is the crucial question you have to answer for yourself today.
A deep dive into the collapsing world of modern money and the mechanics of financial survival. We hope this analysis gives you the necessary tools to navigate the system you're currently in. We'll see you next time.